Yeah, hold on. I'm going to stop showing my screen. I'm kind of nervous that thank you for joining Forensic Analytical Consulting Services today for our webinar on health and environmental impacts caused by catastrophic events, the side effects of wildfires. Today's webinar will be hosted by Forensic Analytical's very own Michelle Rosales, who's a CIH and a senior project manager here at Hvac, as well as Pearl Pereira, who is a professional geologist and the director of the Southern Californian region for Hvac. Before we go over the webinar, the agenda for today's webinar, I want to quickly cover the webinar platform we're using, which is called GoToWebinar. Everyone will start in listen-only mode as you are right now in order to reduce background noise. So this means that your phone is automatically muted. However, this does not mean that you cannot communicate with us. If questions arise for you throughout the webinar, we ask that you enter them into the questions chat box on your screen. When you do this, be sure to select the option Send Question to Staff before submitting. At the end of the presentation, we'll cover all questions that were asked, so please don't be shy. And with that, Michelle will start by going over the agenda of today's presentation.
Thank you, Taylor. Thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. There's so many ways we could talk about the impact of wildfires. It could be monetary value, impact to insurance companies and policies, but for today's purposes, we're going to be going over the environmental impacts, property impact, and also the impact to public health. Okay, Taylor's not letting me advance. There we go. Okay, thank you. For those of you attending that live in California, I'm sure you're aware of all the devastating wildfires we've had in the past few years, especially here in Southern California where I live. Seems to be wildfire season tends to go a little bit longer and starts a little bit earlier as the years go by. However, other states are not immune to this issue, and wildfires continue to devastate their states as well. Because I live in California, I wanted to touch on some of the more devastating wildfires we've had in recent history. In 2017, California saw its most destructive wildfires in history. It brought both the most destructive and largest wildfire in history. It destroyed over 10,000 structures and impacted thousands more. The fires are also responsible for the deaths of 43 people, 41 of those being civilians and 2 firefighters, which is higher than 10 years combined in previous years. The most destructive fire in California history was awarded to the Tubbs Fire, which occurred in Northern California. It burned over 35,000 acres and was responsible for over 22 deaths. Here in Southern California, we had the Thomas Fire, which occurred in the Ventura and Santa Barbara counties, and it's listed as the largest wildfire in California history, where it burned over 280,000 acres and destroyed over 1,000 structures. And most recently is the notorious Carr Fire, which is located in Shasta County, and as of yesterday was 96% contained. And this is responsible for 8 deaths and caused the evacuation of over 36,000 individuals. So without further ado, we will go into discussing the environmental impacts of wildfires.
Thanks, Michelle. So I'm going to walk you through the impacts of environmental impacts from soil wildfire as it relates to soil in particular. So why is soil so important? In general, we basically talk about soils. We cannot have a conversation about wildfires if we don't talk about soils. Soils are the ones that basically cover the natural vegetation throughout the earth, and without that, you're not going to have any wildfire whatsoever. But we have to remember that fires in general can be man-made or it can be naturally occurring. Most of the wildfires that we deal with here in Southern California tend to be a bit of both. If it's really too hot, we get it burning, and then if you have it man-made, we have a large destruction. Michelle just alluded to the Tubbs fire earlier as it related to the largest, being awarded one of the largest destructive fires. And I just read in the news this morning that, PG&E just put up some information on it saying it was related to a private PG&E line wire that was going through. So it's really important to have a conversation with fire as it relates to its soil. So what about soil makes it so interesting, and why do we want to have this conversation? So soil in general, the effects of soil on fire are primarily focused on the heat transfer. This graph kind of gives you an idea of what a really good, healthy soil looks like if you are in, from a biological, chemical, and a physical sense. You have the stability that's there. You have all the bacteria that's working. Vapor transpiration and evaporation occurs with soil. But the minute you start having a large, significant amount of heat transfer, you have the properties of soil that change. And when the properties of soil that change, it not only affects the structural stability of the soil and everything else that's built on it, but it also affects the biological components of the soil and vegetation related, and in turn affects the cover of the soil, where you have the evaporation and transportation of soil and water through the groundwater table as well as to the atmosphere that's affected. So, back again, I wanted to show you what, the Tubbs fire looked like and the destruction that one private electrical line could have done to fire. And you could see that the soil in general looks, dehydrated, if you will, for a better word. But the primary focus behind that is a structural destruction of the soil and everything that's built on top of it. What happens after you have a fire and you have soil structure changed? When you have a little bit of rain, you'll end up having rain falling onto an unstable soil type, resulting in mud flows and landslides. And this is what we've seen in Ventura and Santa Barbara County with the mudslides. It's not that in California we have significant amount of hurricanes where we have mudslides related to water. It is still related to water, but it primarily stems from the destruction of the soil stability coming through fires. So the impact of environmental impact, we all know in general that soils are very important, to be part of the natural vegetation. We also do effective fire treatment of soils in order to develop vegetation, decrease soil growth, but they can also be man-made and destructive in a way where you create a destruction of land. You have increase in some of the noble gases that we need to sort of take care of. But what I want to basically have a take-home effect is, first, soils. When we're talking about soils and wildfires in general, we have to first just only think about the structural stability, and that affects not only the houses that are built on top of them, but also the groundwater and the soil in general that it holds. It's a primary focus as to where fires start and end with. But what do we do about it? So we now know that we basically have a wildfire, we have soils that are an issue. Most people sort of think about it as fires as in what, the physical effects is to the home. Can the home kind of be re-entered? What is the indoor impacts of it? But we also have to think about soil, because that holds everything together. So if you go in and fix the home and change the indoor impacts, if we don't have a concentration on soil stability and the structural use of the soil, we pretty much are not fixing the foundation of what soil causes. So how do we kind of fix the soil stability aspect of it? There's mechanical ways that you can do it, chemical and polymer ways. Chemical is by adding additives to the soil and kind of increasing that stability and strength of the soil. Mechanical ways is by basically regrading and changing the structure. Some of the simple designs that Hvac has done for soil erosion damage is, just build up vegetation, rebuild the soil, rebuild the vegetation structure, and create a simple erosional plan that supports the structural stability of the soil. But I want to kind of move from just the environmental impacts to a more property impact focus on what fires do to properties as well.
When discussing wildfire impact, there's a misconception that the only areas impacted are located within a fire perimeter. However, that statement is false. This photo here is great to show you the location of where the fires occurred and the neighboring areas, but what it doesn't tell you is that there could be impact to properties hundreds, thousands miles away. And there's a number of factors that influence that include weather conditions during the fire event, wind patterns during and directly after the event. The terrain can impact it. For example, if you have a mountain that's high enough, it may reduce the amount of the particulate going in the air and moving to the adjacent areas. So just looking at a fire permit doesn't give you all the information that's necessary. So during and following a fire event, a lot of property owners, insurance companies, and residents are generally looking for answers to questions such as, what is damaged at my property? Is it safe to return to my home? In instances where there's physical damage that's observed, such as, actually burned vegetation at their home, or maybe a portion of their house caught on fire, it's a little easier to answer. But if you don't have that physical damage observed, answering those questions may be a little bit more difficult. So some of the struggles with evaluating a property is the timeline of events. So although we'd like to be out there directly after a fire event, that's generally not the case. A lot of the properties that we assess are typically insurance claims or deal with lawyers. So we may be at a property assessing it days, months, even years after a fire event. So it's hard to try to attempt to identify what occurred during the fire event and directly after there. So there are three essential components when evaluating a fire. And one of those is the history and background. You want to know what fire occurred, what was happening during the fire event. Did they have the windows open? What potential pathways could have got the outdoor fire event to impact the interior of their property? We also want to know information about what's been done to date. Have they already cleaned? Do they have a new ventilation system that's installed? All this information is necessary in order to help us come to conclusions. Most importantly is the sensory observation. So we want to go out there and we want to use our eyes and our noses to investigate. Do we see visible smoke-related particulates, such as when you see in this photo here? Do we smell anything that's indicative of wildfire impact? And then last but not least is the sampling, which is determined based on those two other factors, the background information and the sensory observations. However, once you have all your findings, what does this mean? It's not like asbestos or lead where there's a specific number you can compare it to. It's kind of, I guess you could, we have industry guidelines that kind of look over this, but there's no specific number to compare your results to. So a lot of confusion comes with the word damage as well. The term damage is generally defined as the loss of appearance, utility, or value. However, this term may be subjective by some stakeholders, so insurance companies may determine the word damage to be defined a different way than the homeowner does. So in general, the level of impact to property is dependent on the location of the property relative to wildfire. Again, what wind direction occurred. I may be 1 mile away from the fire, but someone 5 miles away may have more impact based on the winds hitting, coming and distributing more of that smoke-related particulate to their property. And to date, there's limited scientific studies that have been conducted to kind of evaluate what settled wildfire smoke actually does to construction materials or properties. Also, when looking at the impact of wildfires, it's most important to look at the public health impact to it. So I'm going to go over a little bit of what occurs during the actual wildfire, following a wildfire, and then the public health impact to sensitive populations. So it's important to look at what the actual wildfire smoke is composed of in order to determine how it will affect the impact to the public health of the community. So in general, the composition of smoke is dependent on the fuel source and the conditions of combustions and the materials that burned. So when dealing with a wildfire, you're typically dealing with burning of organic debris, trees, brush, And then for some of the larger, more destructive fires, such as the ones I initially spoke on, you may be dealing with structures that are burned and other hazardous materials that may make it a little bit more toxic type environment. So if I just want a general statement of what wildfire is composed of, it's composed of, VOCs, aldehydes, carbon monoxides, nitrogen dioxides, all a list of many components. And it also can contain other respiratory irritants, which in concert can produce eye and respiratory irritation and potentially exacerbate asthma. However, a lot of these components can also be found and are not wildfire specific. So during a wildfire event, counties and air quality management districts will put out documents and advisories regarding air quality. From a public health perspective, they're generally looking at the airborne particulates that are created during the wildfire event. So this would be the small particles that are less than 10 microns, and this is also known as PM10. Also, the smaller particles that can also affect the lungs and heart, which is called PM2.5. So this smoke can irritate your eyes and your respiratory system, and also worsen with chronic and heart and lung diseases in people. So during a wildfire event, we're typically looking at this PM2.5 and PM10 when evaluating air quality. Also, when we are assessing the human health risk caused by a wildfire, it's very important as the investigator to identify how if we're having people stay indoors, how could this particulate or these PM10 2.5s get into the actual property. So we're evaluating pathways in order to evaluate the exposure to the sensitive receptor. On the screen now is the EPA's website, the airnow.gov, which provides an air quality index for specific agents in the air. You can find where you live, where you work, or where you're trying to find out how the air quality is and put it into the program, and it provides a list, an air quality index, and it will level it good, moderate, healthy, unhealthy, and very unhealthy. So looking at these numbers, it can help determine as a company or as an individual whether or not you want to be outside at that time or have individuals working outside. So it gives you the PM10 and the 2.5, which again are the ones they typically look at, but it also gives you several of the other gases that are associated with wildfire events. It is recommended that during a wildfire event that people try to stay indoors as much as possible and to keep their doors and windows shut to avoid any additional entrainment of smoke particulates into the interior environment. If you're heating or cooling air, well, generally you're cooling air during this time, you want to ensure that the ventilation system is turned on recirculation mode with outdoor air dampers closed in order to continually filter the indoor air. However, this may not work if you're in a commercial building where you may need to allow for outdoor air to be introduced. So you may want to add additional filtration to your ventilation system and limit as much as possible the amount of outdoor air coming in. Also, portable air cleaners are recommended, such as those with high efficiency particulates, to try to reduce the amount of particulate coming into the indoor environment. However, I recommend that you don't just pick one, but evaluate your situation and what's going on in occupants in your facility to determine what will work best for trying to improve air quality during a wildfire event. And last but not least is the respiratory protection use. So like all other exposure control methods, you typically don't want to use respiratory protection, but if you have to, it needs to be your last means of defense. It's important to know that prior to wearing respirators or even providing respirators to employees, their limitations and potential issues associated with their respirator use. For example, if respirators can make it harder to breathe, so a doctor or healthcare professional should be advised or retained to discuss the respirator use, especially for individuals who have lung or heart issues. The California Department of Public Health recently put out an advisory in 2018, of July 2018, regarding worker safety in wildfire regions. And they are now stating that employers with operations exposed to wildfire dust must consider taking appropriate measures as part of their injury and illness prevention program. So when engineering administrative controls are used, try to prevent the use of respirators, but if necessary, if you're working in an area considered unhealthy, very unhealthy or hazardous, as defined in the prior slide with the AirGov document, airnow.gov document, that you need to provide those respirators for employees working in those locations. So there's a lot of information available for the health effects and some of the recommendations during a fire, but there's not as much information regarding the two following a fire event, unless those individuals are actually doing the large-scale cleanups. But in terms of, you know, minor dust impact to your home or your commercial property, just with regard to settled dust, there's not much information available of how that may impact you and exactly what's generally composed of in the dust after a certain amount of time. Other issues that people need to take into consideration after a fire or wildfire event is potential electrical safety issues, structural issues. Is it safe to drive on certain locations, especially those within the fire perimeter? And again, the indoor air quality and when and what to clean. So not everyone who's exposed to thick smoke will have health effects, especially following a fire event. The level and duration of exposure, the age of the person, their individual susceptibility, and then including the presence or absence of pre-existing lung or heart diseases play significant roles in whether or not someone will experience smoke-related health symptoms. So mostly healthy adults and children are seen to recover quickly after a smoke exposure and are not suspected to suffer any long-term consequences. However, when you're dealing with certain sensitive populations, these people may experience more severe short-term or chronic exposures following a wildfire. So children, even those without any pre-existing illness or chronic conditions, are considered sensitive populations just because they still have lungs that are developing, and they generally are those who are running around a little bit more and breathing a little bit more during wildfire events outdoors. Several factors lead to increased exposure in children compared to adults. They tend to, again, maybe working, maybe outside playing a little bit more and more susceptible to having more exposures to it. So when we think about where the sensitive population is, they're typically located in daycare centers, again, where children may be, hospitals where we may be dealing with those with immune compromised or lower immune systems, schools, again, somewhere where children will be, nursing homes, senior centers, and shelters. So this is a portion where we can now ask for any questions and let us know how we can assist you with wildfires and soil impact.
Yeah, so we've had a few questions come in. So the first one is the San Joaquin Valley is governed by the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control Board. In the fall, winter, they dictate no burn days in which they state when wood burning, fires, and one's home is forbidden. How does particulate matter from smoke from a fireplace differ from the harmful chemicals released into the same air during a wildfire?
Okay, I will answer that. So yes, burning of wood would be similar. The only difference is, again, when you're dealing with the burning of structures, which could produce a more toxic environment. So generally, when we evaluate structure fires, we evaluate them a lot differently than wildfires, because again, wildfires is generally burning of organic debris and something similar to a fireplace burning. So we take into consideration that there's potential that other structures and materials are also burning with that, not just that specific wood material. So that would be the difference, is that you have a potentially more toxic environment.
All right, and the second question we have is what PM levels are considered of concern following a wildfire?
So the air quality index, I don't have the specific numbers on hand, but they have a number that they have created for evaluation to determine whether or not it would be considered healthy or unhealthy. So if you look on those websites, they give you some specific numbers, but I don't know those specifically offhand. And when I'm doing an evaluation for indoor air quality, sometimes I'm not necessarily just looking at the numbers. I'm also doing comparisons. So I'm comparing the indoors to the outdoors. And then I'm also doing the visual investigations. Is there a specific pathway that I could see the smoke particulate entering? So it's not just generally just a specific number. I look to determine whether or not I think there's impact.
All right, and next question, a few questions here. What about hazardous materials? Are there special considerations to address after a fire?
Pearl, do you want to talk about that regarding soil and the potentials for metals and other materials to be found following a wildfire event that also caused structures to burn down?
Sure. So basically, it just depends on, in terms of soil and any kind of hazardous materials, it depends upon what's been at the site before, what's through the property. So what we've typically done is looked at the neighboring properties, kind of tested for standard volatile organics that occur in households, but also metals, and if there is previous contamination within that area. The one big thing that is a differentiator factor is maybe PCBs as well as pesticides that I tend to shy away from depending on what the site location is. So in standard hazardous materials, you always want to do metals, VOCs, maybe petroleum hydrocarbons, and then the other analysis need to be included based upon site-specific concerns.
And then let me answer for within indoors. So typically we don't sample for all those. We typically just sample for smoke-related particulates, the char, the ash, and the soot, because those are very good indicators. And those are the items that are easiest to sample for. We know they're going to potentially be there, even, days, months, years, if they're not disturbed. Unlike a volatile organic, which may off gas and be gone by the time we get there. So we sample for those materials, but with the idea that there's potentially other contaminants associated with that dust, and then make recommendations for cleaning based on that.
All righty. And do you have examples of air cleaners to use inside during a fire?
Photos of examples? I mean, generally an air scrubber or with a HEPA filtration device is nice for large commercial areas, but some of these smaller, little small portable air filtration devices are nice for smaller spaces to help just, be an additional means to try to remove particulates in the air. But generally you want to use your larger ventilation system, filters, to do the majority of the work.
All righty, the next one's a little longer. There's a great deal of confusion from an employer perspective, understanding when respiratory protection should be necessary. School of thought that regardless how hazardous the air has been classified by airnow.gov, the occupational exposure limit will not be exceeded. Can you comment on it?
Yeah, it's very confusing as well. I've read several documents put out by CDPH, the California Department of Public Health, regarding wildfires, where it as always, there's this gray area where it tells you recommends. It states, I believe, that you are required to provide them respirators, but doesn't necessarily talk about requirement for people to wear them. So again, I think this needs to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis, where they're located, where they're working, what type of work is being done, and as always, using other controls. Are there any engineering controls you can use? Any administrative controls you can use to reduce exposures? And then again, having respirators be the last line of defense to wear, so that we know that they're properly being controlled exposures.
All right, and what are the hazards of the chemicals they dump with planes to suppress fires? What about for workers afterwards?
Sorry, can you state that question again? I had a hard time hearing it.
Yeah. What are the hazards of the chemicals they dump with planes to suppress fires? In addition, what about the workers afterwards?
For the materials for when they're trying to suppress the fires, the planes coming with the fire retardants, there's still not too much research on it. It's when I've looked it up, and I've had a couple requests for sampling for that. So we have done sampling and recommended cleaning, but there wasn't much data available regarding the health effects, or sometimes it was somewhat conflicting. So when I get more information on that, I can let someone know. But in terms of the cleanup, yes, it's similar to I mean, there is documentation out there that they need to wear proper PPE. And again, it's dependent. Are we dealing with cleanup of a completely burned down property where we know there's hazardous materials present, or is it the cleaning of a home 30 miles away that has just a little char and ash? So it's dependent on the level of impact, and it would require an assessment or more additional information to determine what is necessary for the protection of the cleanup crew.
All right, and then can you describe what type of sample collection methods and analysis are used to collect smoke-related particulates in interior environments?
So typically, if this is a home that is, not necessarily heavily impacted, maybe a mile or two away, typically we collect samples of settled dust using the tape lift method. And then we have that sent into the laboratory, and they analyze under polarized light microscopy, and they look under this magnified microscope, and they sit there and they pick out all the pieces and determine using visual area estimation how much of that dust is composed of char, ash, or soot materials. There are also other sampling methods available. The tape lift, again, is my favorite, and it tends to be for the majority of people who do these assessments, because again, you're just using a piece of tape to collect the sample of the dust, and you're not changing it in any way. You're not crushing it. You're not dissolving it. It's just a nice little snapshot of a sample. The other sampling method I would use would be the micro vacuum sample, where you have a filter cassette and you use a pump to suck up dust from a material. So although I love the tape lift, if I wanted to sample a carpet, for instance, a tape lift would not be appropriate, because all I would get would be the carpet fibers. But if I use a micro vacuum sample, I can vacuum up the dust onto this filter, and then they send it to the laboratory, and then they look at the dust that got onto the filter to analyze it for those smoke-related particulates. There are other forms of sampling, the swab or the wipe, which some companies really like. I don't necessarily like them that much. They have a place and purpose at times. Sometimes for wildfires, if I am doing any VOC sampling or looking at PAHs, I may use a wipe sample for those type of analyses. However, if I'm doing just the dust, I generally don't like to use that type of sampling method. So there's pros and cons for all types of methods, and you just got to determine, what's the substrate I'm sampling from, and which one would be best to get the most representative sample.
Okay, and this last one's a little bit longer here. Are HVAC air filters effective in filtering the airborne contaminants in the air from a nearby wildfire? Or would you recommend a homeowner or building owner have their HVAC system cleaned when the fire is out and the smoke or ash has cleared? Can there be hazardous residue that settles in the system that can be kicked up when the air conditioning or heater turns back on?
Okay, so it's all dependent on your HVAC system. So let's say, for instance, a hospital has very high filter efficient, filters in there. So they may be able to filter out the majority, if not all, of the smoke particulates that, from a nearby fire. However, a facility that has loose fitted filters, they're really low efficiency, they may allow for a lot of that particulate to get into the environment. So one of the sampling locations we do when we're sampling the indoor air or the property would be to sample from supply registers or return registers to identify whether or not it got into the system and is then training it into the rest of the indoor air. So it's all dependent on the amount of impact and how efficient their filters are. So there are times where I would recommend cleaning of the HVAC system based on the level of impact and their specific HVAC system at the property I'm assessing. But it's not always a guarantee that it's going to get in there. So you've got to evaluate it that way.
Okay, and is it common for labs to know this analysis? It's getting more common. A lot of the companies, especially on the West Coast, do a lot of this analysis, and it's good to contact them and ask them because, again, some laboratories just do specifically structure fire analysis, and again, they may sound the same and they may use some of the same equipment. However, you're looking for specific materials that are associated with wildfire, so burning up plant and organic materials. So I would contact my laboratory and talk to them a little bit, and some are better than others. So it's just like any type of analysis. You should probably call them and get some comfort with whoever's doing the work or whoever is your contact to find out the level of knowledge they have in that specific subject. Okay, and the next question is, how much does a typical inspection cost?
Again, that depends. This probably runs around, it's depending. If we're just doing the evaluation of surfaces and not necessarily air quality, it may run about $2,500 to $3,500 depending on the size of the property and what questions you want answered. So we're, before we go out, we're trying to answer what questions you may have. Air quality assessments may run the same or a little bit more depending on, again, the questions. Were you next to a house that completely burnt down? Well, we may add different sampling strategy than maybe you being 5 miles away from the wildfire perimeter. So it's every home we try to treat separately in its own to determine what's the best way to evaluate it.
Okay, and the next question was, how many samples would you take for a typical 2,000 square foot house?
So again, if I'm just evaluating whether or not the structure itself was impacted, generally around 12 to 14 maybe for that. So I want to hit on, the exterior attic. I want to look at the exterior entry point. So making sure to concentrate on window seals from the interior, flooring next to the exterior entry points, and then going a little bit more into the home, looking at contents, furnishings, again, the HVAC system. So I'm hitting all these little points to try to draw conclusions on this, 2,000 square foot property.
Okay, and then can you please repeat what types of analysis are conducted for exterior environments?
I'm confused by the question, so can you read that again?
Yeah, is it soil related or?
I believe so. All of the question says is, can you repeat what types of analyses are conducted for exterior environments? I'm assuming this is soil related.
So if it's soil, it depends on what the purpose is. If you're looking for soil stability and restructuring of the soil, it's a different type of analysis. If you're looking for waste disposal in general, that's the standard analysis for volatile organics, metals, total petroleum hydrocarbons, and then some site-specific compounds. But structural stability to analyze if you can rebuild on the soil or to determine what other soil stabilization structures you need, that's very site-specific to see what the concerns are at that site.
Alrighty, and that was the last question. So unless any more pop up here in the next few seconds, that concludes the webinar for today. Do you guys have anything else you wanted to add, or?
I don't.
Nope.
No, thank you so much. Thank you guys for attending.
Thank you. Feel free to contact us directly if you have any additional questions or concerns. Like I said, we usually take this on a case-by-case basis, depending on what you're looking for to determine what's necessary to evaluate your property.
Absolutely, and we'll be sending out Pearl and Michelle's contact information shortly after this webinar, as well as a recording of it, so you guys can reference it or send it out to colleagues. So thank you all again for attending, and have a great rest of your day.